Well, welcome to the next chapter of Esther that we're going to explore today. The topic that I've been given is Kairos moments in our lives that cost. So I thought perhaps first of all we better just define what Kairos means. It's an ancient Greek word meaning the right, critical or opportune moment. The right, critical or opportune moment. So let's just look at this story and see where there may be some of those right, critical or opportune moments that have arisen. In the third year of Xerxes' reign, he'd spent 6 months parading his wealth, culminating in a vast banquet. The queen had held a similar one for the women. And after a week of celebration, when the king was quite high on wine, he sent his eunuchs for Queen Vashti, as he wanted to parade her before the people, the men, the trophy wife. Some documents suggest that she was asked or told to appear naked. She refused, probably on the grounds of respect and decency. Do we blame her for not wanting to be a showpiece? In that day, it was a punishable offence to say no to the king, and of course punishment ensued. She was deposed. That was certainly a critical moment for her when she made that decision to say no. The reasoning was that if women knew that she'd said no and got away with it, then it would undermine all the men who it was thought should be able to rule in their own households, and the women were supposed to do exactly as they were told. And we've explored the echoes of that in today's society after Chris spoke to us a few weeks ago. Then Xerxes, when he'd cooled down, his advisors were sent to restock the harem with a view to one of the girls becoming the new queen. Mordecai, a Jewish exile, had a beautiful niece called Esther. He forbade her to reveal her nationality, and Haggai was a king's eunuch, and Esther obviously got on well with him as he gave her some useful tips how to get into the king's good books, or his bed. After a night with the king, she was shipped off to the harem as usual, and she only saw the king when he called for her. Obviously, Xerxes liked her and she was crowned queen. That was certainly a critical moment, wasn't it, for the Jews? Close reading of that text shows that it was about 3 years after Vashti had refused the king, and also that Esther had been plucked out of society, probably unwillingly, and put in the harem. In Jewish law, she was living immorally, but that was through no fault of her own. Then she was elevated to queen. It's interesting, isn't it, how the deposed and probably moral queen is supplanted, and how God uses human situations. Mordecai, meanwhile, hung around the king's gates. Perhaps he was making sure that Esther was okay, when he overheard a plot to kill the king. He told Esther, and Mordecai was actually given credit for this. She must have told the king or some official because it was written down in the annals. That was certainly a critical moment for the life of the Jews, that it was recorded. Essentially, Mordecai saved the king's life. And we hear of these things today, don't we? Where there are plots to oust leaders, the gunpowder treason and plot still goes on. At some point, Haman was honoured by the king. We're not quite sure why, but the people were told they had to bow down to him. In chapter 3, verse 7, we're told it was the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, and Mordecai persistently refused to bow down to this man. Rather than take revenge solely on Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jewish exiles on the pretext that they were a threat to the king. As we learned from Chris last week, This hatred went back to a time when King Saul battled against the Amalekites. Anti-Semitism was alive and well at that time. But because of this, the Jews' fate was sealed. Now the scene is set for today's passage. Many Jews, including Mordecai, resorted to sackcloth and ashes, publicly acknowledging a tormented spirit. But we do note that there are no religious references in this. Esther's maids and eunuchs told her about Mordecai. They must have been loyal attendants to her, and perhaps they knew about Esther's relationship to Mordecai. Otherwise, why would they have told her? Then Mordecai refused the clothing that Esther sent. And it's interesting that it's one of the king's eunuchs who was dispatched to seek the necessary information and to find out the reason for this. We don't know if he knew of Esther's heritage before this. Certainly it would become common knowledge. Esther does not seem at that point to have had any direct contact with Mordecai. However, Mordecai, having heard the king's edict to destroy the Jews, gets a copy of it and informs Esther. He says that she will not escape the execution either. For this you were born. Mordecai, however, had the faith that the Jewish race would survive, but Esther and her family, and probably the rest of the Jews in that empire, would be slaughtered. He recognizes the providence of God in human affairs and reminds Esther of her high position and her Jewish heritage. And as well as reminding her, it tells us that we are to be mindful of those less blessed than we are. She was given a choice, and that was certainly a critical or a kairos moment for her. For now, Esther is afraid for her own life. If she appears before the king uncalled for, she could die, or if she doesn't, then she almost certainly would die. She hadn't been summoned recently, and that's why she goes on to say, "Fast for me," because she knew the risk that she was taking. But that's for next week. So I've thought of a couple of other women for whom this term, for this you were born. Now, can you guess who wrote this when she was 8 years old? Oh, what a happy child I am, although I cannot see. I am resolved that in this world contented I will be. How many blessings I enjoy that other people don't. So weep or sigh, because I'm blind, I cannot, or I won't. And this was all because of a medical accident that happened when she was 6 weeks old. Later in life, she wrote Blessed Assurance and To God Be the Glory. It was, of course, Fanny Crosby. She was born into a Christian family, but came to a true personal faith around the age of 30. That was truly a critical moment for her because of we can tell that because of the depth of her hymns and songs that she wrote, and we've certainly been blessed by many of those. Another woman who came to my mind was Amy Carmichael. She was born into a Christian family, this time in Northern Ireland, and she was called to be a missionary. First she went to Japan and then to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where she rescued both girls and boys from being sold into temple prostitution. And she'd had to make a critical decision there that affected her whole life. Both of these women, like Esther, were born at a particular time for a particular purpose in God's timing and plan. So what about the calling of the disciples? Let's just remind ourselves of that definition. The ancient word meaning right, critical, or opportune moment. Were they born for such a time as this too? In Luke, we see a transformation of a situation. The text says that Jesus got into one of the boats. There were 2 boats. Why that one? Perhaps this was an opportune moment for Jesus, that the boats happened to be there. Why choose Simon's? Seems he didn't object. In Matthew and Mark Gospels, there seems to be a direct call to Simon and Andrew, slightly different from this one in Luke, and that's something you can explore in your home groups next week. But just returning to Luke now, Jesus transforms the situation. A long night of fishing with no results, and he turns that into an overwhelming one, and it just overtakes the disciples. Simon Peter had obviously allowed Jesus into his boat, but what a reward. The disciples' decisions to follow Jesus were critical moments for them, and it totally changed both their spiritual and their working lives. All these people, and many more of course, have had life-changing situations. The gift of Jesus in our lives releases the gifts of the Spirit. It seems too good to be true, doesn't it? And yet we see folk resisting. I hear people say, oh, I don't want anything to do with Jesus. I don't want anything to do with charismatic things. Do they really mean they don't want to know and they don't want anything to do with any gifts that God may give us? You can look those gifts of the Spirit up, of course, in 1 Corinthians 12. You know, are we willing to receive and perhaps be overwhelmed like those disciples? Are we willing to make life-threatening decisions like Esther? So let's just return to the actual topic, moments in our lives that cost. To what extent has there been a transformation in your life and mine since saying, yes, I believe in Jesus? Let's just think about that for a moment as we just ask God's Spirit to move among us. Just take a few moments just to think about that. What has changed or what would be different in your life if you didn't have Jesus? Are we born at a particular time for a particular purpose in God's overarching plan? I think about the timing of my own birth. If I'd been born when my parents wanted, 8 years earlier, I wouldn't have had the opportunities that have come my way. And what about moments in our lives that perhaps have cost? Have you had any? I can say taking up ministerial training cost me financially, emotionally and personally. And I guess there are many times when you too have had consequences of your decisions. And certainly in the last few months we've had the opportunity to reflect on our lives and what matters most to us, to consider some of these defining moments. In some cases we may have been able to help and support others. I know that many, and particularly those of us who live alone or who live in difficult circumstances, have valued these church services. I know they of course produce us a few headaches, but we're grateful for them. Not grateful for the headaches, but grateful for the people who sort all this technology out. Sometimes we may encounter personal or perhaps national injustice. And we may need to step up to the mark and put a shoulder to the wheel, stand up for what we believe to be right. I remember Peter Lawrence once saying to me, there are some situations where you need to go to the stake, and if it's necessary, you go. If it's not, keep your head down. Been there, had a few brickbats. I've also just been writing a sermon for Wednesday, the Wednesday morning email service that we do, about Paul's freedom of choice. That sermon's particularly about payment for preaching, but sometimes we have to make all sorts of choices and decisions, and I pray for guidance to make wise ones. Just another little aside, there's also the International Kairos Prison Ministry, where prisoners are offered a 3 or 4 day weekend to explore the Christian faith. And I know when it was running at Portland Prison, the reoffending rate was considerably reduced among those who went to the sessions. They also give support for the families too, and prisoners are told about Jesus and given the choice of following or not and finding their own critical decision time. So, let's just summarise what we may have thought about today. First of all, have patience. Oh, it's not easy, is it? The whole narrative of Esther takes place over about 12 years. You know, we often hear somebody's testimony in 5, 10, 15 minutes, forgetting it probably will have taken many years to get to their present place of understanding. So have patience. I have a friend who has a t-shirt who has Christian under construction emblazoned on it. That's probably true for all of us, isn't it? Mordecai was a wise counsellor, telling Esther not to divulge her ethnicity till the time was right. His loyalty in shielding the king was recorded. Now that was invaluable, something that was done several years before, and it was invaluable at the time. We too should do that. Make a note if there's something significant that happens. Certainly it was drummed into me in my medical training. Make sure you write it all down. So we need to do that, so watch your back. Tread carefully and wisely. And Esther, of course, must have had a good relationship with her keepers. We're told to obey God's commandments. And although restrained by the parameters of her culture, Esther knew that it was necessary to pray and to fast and to seek wisdom. The disciples recognised life-changing opportunities for a better, a more meaningful life, a life of love and compassion and self-sacrifice. So, be patient, be wise, obey the commandments, and seek and recognise those opportunities as we look to follow Jesus. Amen.